Black communities are not violent, they're victims of violence. And so what you have is hurt people hurting people. It's divestment in communities. It's basically saying my life doesn't matter. People are upset, they're hurting, they're in pain, and they want revenge. And I'm sorry, they don't want revenge, they want justice. My name is Franklin Cosey-Gay. I'm the Executive Director for the Chicago Center for Youth Violence Prevention that's housed in the School of Social Work that's known as the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. We try to understand the causes and the nature of violence. We also implement, design, and evaluate violence prevention programs. There's a sociologist named Louis Waquant that talks about three themes that have happened to the African American community in the context of being in the United States. And one is around stigmatization, right? And I use that to even think about, before coming to the United States, how Africans in West Africa were viewed as non-humans and subject to servitude. They were non-Christians and subject to servitude. So the three themes that he talks about is stigmatization, containment, and disruption. So the theme that happens across all of those systems is that you have stigmatized a group, you've contained them, whether it was, you've disrupted their family systems, their economic systems, right? And then you've contained them, whether it's the slave ship, whether it's the shackles, right? Whether it's Jim Crow segregation, whether it is, as we described, the Black Belt when Black migrants came from the South in Chicago, containing them, using restricted covenants as a marketplace and a community-based strategy, using redlining as a way now you're digging into the pockets. What it is that it's the persistence of different mechanisms to dehumanize Black people that has a long history, right? In addition, what you're doing is you're degrading the social fabric of those communities through those disruptions, through those containments. What do I mean by that? The social organization of the community, the ability to support each other, the ability to have a belief system that can be enforced by key people in the community that's all about building community, right? And so how do you degrade that? Earlier I talked about the 600 to 700% in incarceration. When you lock up people who can handle beef, who can handle conflict that happens in the community without it getting violent, then you have lost human capital, right? So throughout this time, you've had human capital, right? You've had communities. We have continued, although it was continually contained and disruption that happened. You had the Black Belt that was disrupted through the 1994, the Dan Ryan, Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley purposely decided where they wanted that system to go through. It disrupted Black communities. It did not disrupt white communities. So now the new containment system is the housing projects, right? Housing projects, now again, you reactivate, you figure out social support and structure, but then that's destroyed, right? And so now the system persists again. Schools closing, again, like I have relationships with adults. For our young children, some of the first adults that you see outside your family in an institution is through a school. So what does that mean in terms of me bonding with another adult, and now that school is closed and I lose that bond, right? So this system of disruption, containment, and stigmatization persists, but what's also happening is that the things that kept communities safe in terms of the social organization is also being disrupted. One of the major factors in that is the hyper-incarceration of Black bodies in these communities. So who are the people that can handle this conflict? Now you also have access to guns, right? You have hyper access to guns. You have guns now that are way more efficient, that actually shoot more rounds, per second. And so that also contributes to that. And as I mentioned before, my father is a Vietnam veteran. And he says, you know what, Frank, shooting a pistol is a difficult thing, right? it's not designed to be shot across the street. It's supposed to be in close quarters. So you have youth, again, who are on different levels of trajectory, handling their conflict with guns that are difficult to shoot. You have people who weren't intended to be shot. All of their lives matter, regardless of their lives. They're not just perpetrators, they're victims of a system as well, a structural system, but also interpersonally. They're shooting someone who maybe wasn't their target, and now you have other people that are hurting and pain. They're shooting someone that was a target, but there's this whole structural component that they've been impacted by as well. So people want justice, right? Again, they want justice. Why do they want justice? Because they have seen their communities stigmatized, contained, and disrupted on so many different levels. Let's think about, earlier I talked about the different ethnic groups that were here in Chicago, all coming here for better opportunities through the jobs that were available through industry, right? So when African Americans came, prior to that, you had groups like Irish, you had Slavs that were being discriminated against, right? Because of their ethnic heritage, their faith, right? So now, how can we begin to use race as a context to stigmatize, using white supremacy as a platform to make ourselves better than this group and to dehumanize this group? And so the stigmatization is a strategy of white supremacy. And white supremacy is a global phenomenon, right? Yeah, so white supremacy, we have to think about the role that slavery played, not only the countries that were involved, but also through the slave-based economies that were generated, right? A lot of times we think about, in the United States context, North versus South, right? And we think, oh, well, the northern cities weren't involved in slavery. Well, they're actually contributing. New York City were large investors in the slave-based system, right? And northern cities as well. Banks that we go down on LaSalle were as well, right? So everyone's complicit in the white supremacy, and it's global. We need to wrap our heads around that. Part of that is through understanding through history. We can't omit history and understand the role that plays to help people kind of unpack how white supremacy has denied the humanity of people of color. It is definitely passed down subconsciously. It is also passed down through our culture, through the way that we interact, dress, talk, speak. Definitely, it is a part of a lot. This Bell Hooks has this term that she talks about in terms of the role that oppression plays, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, in terms of the mechanisms that has played in terms of oppression. Really what I think about is, what is my definition of oppression, right? And is when you deny the humanity of another individual, right? And so white supremacy is a function within that umbrella, right? It is denying the humanity of people of color because of their race and using that to your advantage. And I see that as a global system that falls within oppression. I like to actually provide a historical story in terms of the origins of the wage gap in itself. Many African Americans were escaping the South to escape racial terrorism, but also to take advantage of the opportunities in industry that existed in northern cities like Chicago, right? And so what you saw in Chicago is that now I have an opportunity to at least decrease the wage gap that existed so it wouldn't be as large as it was in the South, right? And you actually saw at its closest point in 1950, where you had African Americans that were working, they were providing. It didn't require like much education to provide a home, a car, and a nice living for your family, right? And so as an African American, but as deindustrialization happened, as white flight happened, you start to see a shift in that, right? And the same time, the African American population is still building, right? It builds at its peak in 1980, where it was nearly, African Americans accounted for nearly 40% of Chicago's population. But over the past 30 to 40 years, the African American population has been decreasing at a rate of almost 10,000 per year, right? So what's going on? there are large speculation that it's actually the income wage gap that's now, because of hyper incarceration, because of the unequitable distribution of resources and social services, and instead focusing on criminal justice systems, and quite frankly, to the persistence of racism, blacks who might have PhDs, who might have MBAs, JDs, still not making as much within this structure, within this place, are saying, you know what, I'd be better off leaving. So now you're beginning to see African Americans leaving Chicago because the wage ratio gap between whites and blacks is beginning to mirror the same period as the Great Migration between 1914 and 1918, that first period where the wage gap was so large. Let's think about income and violence, right? So the issue again is equitable access and opportunity, right? So what opportunity do I have as a family member, as a young adult, to earn income equitably? And African Americans are finding that systematically that's not happening. So what ways are we going to use to survive? In the 70s and 90s, that access was through the underground economy, through drugs. What's actually continuing to contribute to the violence right now is not through this type of underground economy, right? What's happening is that you're having an isolation of communities that don't have access to resources, that are frustrated, that want equitable access, and because of the frustration, because of the lack of investment in the community, there are no longer adults that are there, that are present, that are rooted in that community, because black families are leaving, right? As you drive to South Shore, or if you drive to the University of Chicago, if you go down certain streets, you'll see blocks and blocks of emptiness, right? Where's the investment? You have the disappearance of the black population. So who are the people that can actually activate and be in places to moderate or to facilitate a nonviolent response to conflict? It doesn't exist, right? I won't say it doesn't exist, because it certainly does exist. There are strong organizations, there are assets in the community, but it's disappearing, right? And so the issue is that it's divestment in communities. It's basically saying my life doesn't matter, right? And because of the frustration and the trauma that you faced, and the access to guns, and the lack of adults and institutions to be able to mediate that conflict, you have persistent violence that's happening. There's a saying that if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so part of it is that, where are we focusing our attention? A lot of times we're focusing our attention on the deficits, right? However, there is an issue in terms of what's happening to our communities and the violence that's happening in our communities. And it's not that our communities are violent, they're victims of violence, and they're using violence as a way to achieve justice. And that is not gonna work. Their humanity has been systematically and structurally denied, right? I talked initially about access to developing equity through homes, right? But so that's a memory that grandma has, right? And now mama has grown up in a system where she's seen the jobs disappear that her mother or her father had, right? Those jobs are no longer available, right? She knew that her grandmother or her mom or dad maybe only had a high school diploma, but they were able to own a car and own a home, right? Now those opportunities are gone, right? And so mom has been denied that way, right? As I mentioned, in the 70s, you have white flight, right? So you have a tax base that's gone, and you have systems now that don't operate the same because that tax base is gone. So now you have city budgets, county budgets that are not operating with the same amount of funding that they used to. And so instead of focusing on solutions through social services, they look for criminal justice systems to be that agent, and that is the wrong structure, right? And so that process now is what grandma's seeing, what mama's seeing, and now that child has seen their schools close, they've seen housing be disrupted, and as a result, socially, they have to navigate these spaces, right? As I mentioned before, some of the origins of gang development in Chicago was turf-based, right? So let's pan out a little bit and not look at it as a black problem, but just as a social problem that exists, but it's concentrated in black communities now that no longer have opportunities to escape, right? Opportunities to age out, to get jobs because the jobs are not available, right? Opportunities to get quality education because the quality education, the investment's not equitable. Well, now what they do is they find themselves in a situation where it's easy to get trapped, right? It's easy to get trapped in conflict, and it's also easy to get trapped in police brutality, right? For being targeted, because now these communities unfortunately are stigmatized as being hyper criminal, right? So as an African American man, if you're dressed a certain way, you're going to be profiled. You might be, blamed for a crime that happened. You don't have investment in communities and structures. You don't have an investment in individuals that say, hey, I'm a key person who you could trust. I'm someone you know, who you grew up with, and I can help squash beef. Conflict is natural. It's how we handle conflict, which is the issue. When you have a stigmatization of our black and brown youth as being gang members, then we're not connecting as a community, and that is what's happening not only in Chicago, but across our nation. Investment, right? All right, so who do we invest in? Well, first of all, one of the quickest ways to invest is investing early, right? It might say, okay, investing early is actually not quick, but early investment through early childhood will have a long-term effect in society, right? So we need to think about that. The other way is, let's think about who are the victims right now of violence, right? The victims are young adults, 18 to 24, right? That have already been involved in a violent incident or have been already arrested. There are strategies that involve using credible messengers through street outreach, and there are a lot of great programs that exist in the city of Chicago, investing in them because they represent a return to the social structure that has been removed, because they have lived the life that you're asking others to consider alternatives to, right? And so that is another one. So early childhood, investing in street outreach, and then who are the other credible messengers that have gone through the structural harm that's happened? The community-based organizations, building up the capacity for them because they have the relationships, right? Remember, we're talking about behavior change, and behavior change is hard, right? So what helps with behavior change? People that you can trust and people that you know, right? We can't look to the criminal justice system to help us with safety, right? We have to look to the social services that exist in the community, because again, strong communities are simply people who have a belief about their community, they come together around that, and they're able to uphold the beliefs that they have about their community.